Hello and good evening, everybody. We are here with an extra special Decline and Fall broadcast for you today. Apologies for the slight interruption just a minute ago. Brief connection crash. So today we're going to be having a very special guest on in just a moment. We're going to be having Dan Kovalik join us. If you've been watching the Minel, you'll have seen Dan come on there before to talk about his visit to Russia and to Donbass in particular. And we're having Dan back today on the Decline and Fall show because this is an incredibly relevant moment to have him on due to a recent, shall we say, contretemps between President Petro of Colombia and, of course, President Trump of the United States. Now, Dan and Kit are here in the waiting. Let's just add them in.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Right, Kit Clarenberg in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, and Dan Kovalik in the I'm sure it was at some point the future socialist United States. How are you all doing?
Yeah, I don't know if I'll live to see that, but yes, I'm good. How are you all doing?
Yeah, very
Excellent,
well. Very well. All the better for seeing you, Dan.
That's very kind. Thank you. Very nice to see both of you.
So
I miss London a lot.
Well, Dan, good to have you here, and an opportune moment because, as I was just saying in the introduction to the audience, we wanted to have you on because of the recent clash between Trump and President Petro of Colombia, and the sanctions that have been placed on the Colombian president, and his announcement that, of course, a certain Mr. Kovalik was his legal representative in the United States. So I thought, well, I know that guy. So what the ideal man to talk to? Of course, Dan is the author of a book entitled "The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela," so very relevant for the times that we're living in. But Dan, if you want to start off by just outlining the trajectory that, for instance, President Petro has gone on, because as it seems that he has become increasingly critical of the United States role, both in Colombia and regionally within the wider South American nations, and more supportive of the stance taken by President Maduro. And this has led, it seems, along with his stance against the genocide in Gaza, into a more and more direct confrontation with the United States, and leads to the sanctions taken out on him and his family. So, Dan, I'll give you the floor if you want to talk about the situation that's evolved here, and if you want to, your own involvement with it.
Yeah, well, first of all, if I can just briefly say, I've known Petro for 20 years and followed his political career pretty closely. The guy's lived 100 lives. I think, in fact, he has a memoir that says something like that. He was a guerrilla. He was with the M19 guerrillas. He then signed a peace deal, which allowed him to run for office, which he did. He became a senator. That's when I got to know him. When he was a senator, he was very outspoken about what was then called the parapolitical scandal, the scandal involving politicians and sitting government officials who had close ties with the paramilitary death squads. He then became mayor of Bogota, which is considered a possible springboard for the presidency. But at some point, the president intervened, took his mayorship away. He then regained it. He then ran for president, became president. And as you said, when he initially was president, and even when he was running, he said various things that were very tempered about Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. He was very critical of all three of those countries. I remember him saying once that Cuba was not a model for anything but failure, and he was very critical of Maduro. Didn't even recognize Maduro's most recent election, in fact. But as you say, I do think he's become, with some time as president, I think he felt freer to be probably open with a lot of the things he believed, and also saw no reason to hold back anymore, seeing what was happening in the world, particularly, as you say, in Gaza. He's become maybe the most effective spokesperson for Gaza in the world. I mean, his speech at the UN was incredible. He's the one person talking about possibly using the UN's Uniting for Peace resolution to call on peacekeeping forces to go to Gaza and protect the people of Palestine. And this has put him on a collision course with the United States. When he was in the UN, he gave that very, very passionate speech about Gaza. He then ended up on the streets, if you remember, with Roger Waters at a protest, also speaking out about Gaza, saying that U.S. troops should refuse unjust orders of Trump, which include blowing up these boats of innocents in the Caribbean. And it was shortly after that that these sanctions followed. So he also announced, right before the sanctions were imposed, that he was pulling Colombia out of the NATO partnership it had agreed to before he became president. And that, of course, was a very seen by Trump as a provocative act. So, you know, all this has gotten him into hot water, and now he's on this OFAC list, which is making his life very difficult. I don't know if you saw the problem he had in Spain. He was flying back from the Middle East and went to refuel in Spain, and all the private refueling companies refused to refuel the plane because of the OFAC designation. But to their credit, the government of Spain had him pulled into a military hangar, and he was provided with oil by the state of Spain. But that's where he's at. His life is going to become very difficult, where he was not going to be able to transact business with anyone, use any banks. And this will have a cascading effect with Colombia, too, where it will end up, unfortunately, probably impacting the Colombian economy and the Colombian people. That's how these sanctions tend to work. Anyway, that is my kind of very quick summary of the situation.
Thanks, Dan. And just to draw on what you were saying there, the radicalization of President Petro's position has gone along with what seems to be an ever more aggressive Trump White House policy towards the Caribbean states and the Central and Southern American states. It seems that as the U.S. empire suffers embarrassment and defeat in Ukraine, for instance, and has tried to wage a trade war on China and has failed in terms of their inability to get the Chinese to buckle, it seems that Trump, or more is perhaps more accurate to say Rubio, is coming up with a plan to assert like Monroe Doctrine on steroids across targeting all the governments that the U.S. has for a long time sought to undermine. It seems that Trump is trying to either instigate some kind of or hope to trigger some kind of regime change operation in Venezuela, or to intimidate Maduro into quitting the country or something. But what do you see as the strategy that the Trump administration is pursuing here with regard to Colombia, Venezuela, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's naked violence. I mean, he's murdered over 50 people in the Caribbean. Again, with no charges against these people, no proof they did anything wrong. We know, at least in a few instances, who they were, that they were just innocent fishermen. And as I point out over and over to people, you know, the proper thing to do, if you really thought people were drug traffickers, you would arrest them, you would try them, you would sentence them, you would convict them, sentence them. But even if you did all that, even in the U.S. and states that have the death penalty, drug trafficking is not a capital crime. It would not result in the death penalty. So there's nothing legal at all about what's happening. This is just murder, pure and simple. What is he trying to do with that? What is he trying to do with sending, a naval flotilla to threaten Venezuela? I do think, as you say, that part of the strategy is just to intimidate. I think maybe he hopes he could coax some sort of coup in Venezuela against Maduro. Maybe he now hopes he can do the same in Colombia against Petro. This is what was known at the early part of the 20th century as gunboat diplomacy. Was it Teddy Roosevelt who came up with that? I'd have to look again. But we're going back many presidents. I mean, the U.S. certainly has tried to overthrow and is in some cases overthrown a number of countries in the world and in the Western Hemisphere over the years and over recent years. But using the Navy in this way in the Western Hemisphere to threaten other countries is something the U.S. really hasn't done for a long time. You could look, the closest, analogy would be the invasion of Panama in 1989, which was a long time ago. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Navy was used in that way. And of course, the invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965. But these are fairly older incidents. Most of what the U.S. has done in Latin America in recent decades has been covert. And using the military in this more aggressive way is old-timey, I would say. Again, this looks more like you saw in the early 20th century. And in the 21st century, one would have thought this would have been unacceptable, right? That this was not something people would tolerate. And yet, the West seems very tolerant of it. The Western media, Western governments, for the most part, the Western populations, which at least are not protesting en masse against it, though I think the polls show not much support for it. In Venezuela, I saw polls showing about less than 4% of the population supports any intervention by the U.S., which means even the vast majority of even people who oppose Maduro don't support intervention. And why would they, right? I mean, this is insane. Like, I don't like Donald Trump, but I don't want some other country invading to overthrow him and putting in someone else. I mean, that's just not how these things are done in the civilized world. But we're not civilized. I mean, we're seeing a real move backwards in terms of any respect for international law, even a nod to caring about human rights. It's just really something. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. Ken, do you want to come in?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite extraordinary what the Trump administration is doing and how little condemnation is emanating from the left within the US about Trump's actions. I mean, the same sources who are very quick and with some legitimacy to condemn Trump's domestic agenda as somehow fascistic, they are completely silent on what appears to be a build-up to a very serious conflict within against Latin America. I mean, there are shades of Operation Condor here, and yet there's not the criticism one might expect, of that. Why do you think that is?
Well, was there much criticism of Operation Condor? I mean, the truth is the Western media has always been very tolerant of the U.S. foreign policy objectives of any president, no matter what party they were from. And recall, and I noted this and wrote about it at the time, recall during Trump's first term, when a lot of the mainstream press, including the New York Times, NPR, were very critical of Trump from the get-go. I remember, I think it was the New York Times saying, had an op-ed. They said the first time that Trump acted presidential, in their view, is when he bombed Syria. That is the mentality of the mainstream press. They support U.S. aggression abroad. And again, even if it's Trump doing it, they, as you say, they may be critical of all of his domestic policy. They may dislike his just modus operandi, his coarseness and brutishness. But in terms of foreign policy, they're okay with it. And the truth is, while it seems to be, Trump has a difference in style of his foreign policy, in essence, it's not much different than his predecessors from Biden or Obama. I mean, I remind people, as we are horrified, and we should be horrified at Trump bombing boats in the Caribbean, we have to still be reminded that Obama was, one thing he seemed to really like to do is bomb wedding parties in the Middle East, if you recall, and funerals. So this isn't anything new, particularly. Again, I think it's a little more aggressive in appearance, but it's not a difference so much in kind, but in style. And again, so the media is totally fine with that. And the problem is that no one challenged Obama when he was murdering wedding parties in Yemen, and no one cared. And no one cared about the war he started in Yemen. Where I was, I'm sure we were all reading at the time, after 2015, when Obama started that war, that millions of people could die from famine in Yemen due to this. Did anyone care? And by the way, what happened to those 2 million people that were supposed to have possibly died? Are they dead? No one knows, and no one cares. So, that is the truth, that there is incredible tolerance in the American society and in the American ruling class and intellectual sphere for this sort of aggression. It's as American as apple pie, sadly. It's how the West was won, and people hate to be reminded of that. But it's in the DNA of America, and it's very hard to challenge for that reason.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, I wanted just to follow up on the allegations, which are of course ludicrous, but what Trump is hiding behind is the claim that this is all like anti-drugs operations, and that this is that Venezuela is behind getting like large amounts of narcotics into the United States. But isn't the truth, Dan, like literally like the opposite way around? Which is that although that some South American countries might produce like the raw materials that make up narcotics that get sold in the United States and other Western countries have been central to drug rackets and collaborations with drug racketeers for many, many decades now. And if Trump was actually serious about wanting to tackle who brings narcotics into the United States, he'd look at several, shall we say, close associates of the U.S. intelligence agencies that have done it for many, many decades. So this is transparent nonsense, but it's almost a confession by reverse. It's like every accusation is a confession. The U.S. says Venezuela is the chief drug dealer, supplying misery to the streets of the cities of America, but the call is coming from inside the house in this case, isn't it?
Yes, well, there's a lot of things to unpack there. I mean, first of all, there was this Rand Corporation study from 1994 that shows it's 20 times more effective to deal with drug treatment and addiction treatment at home than to try to eradicate drugs at the source. Okay. So, first of all, the way to deal, if you care about drug problems in the US, the first thing you do is you extend drug treatment centers, mental health support. You make sure people have jobs, you make sure they're fed, that they have health care, all those things. That's what would really help more than anything. Okay. And that's the last thing Trump's doing. In fact, he's destroying the social safety net as we speak. Right. And that's what leads people to addiction, to alcohol, to drugs. So that's a starter. Also, as you say, the U.S. intelligence agencies, the CIA, DEA, have done more to engage in drug trafficking than any institutions in the world. Recall Ronald Reagan, despite his "Say No to Drug" campaign, his CIA ran cocaine right to the U.S. cities in order to fund the Contras. The CIA did a similar thing with heroin in what they called the Golden Triangle in Asia during the Vietnam War. In Colombia, it's very well known. In fact, it's dealt with in the show Narcos, which is that was an excellent show. I don't know if you ever saw it, but they dealt with the truth that the U.S. supported the Cali cartel against the Medellin cartel of Pablo Escobar, because they didn't like Escobar's kind of social, he had some social programs he did for the poor, and that made him very unsavory for them. And the Cali cartel that the DEA and CIA supported ended up becoming the AUC paramilitaries. The head of that cartel was Carlos and Fidel Castano, who started the AUC paramilitary death squads that were quite brutal, that Petro denounced, that I had denounced at that time, that the U.S. was at least indirectly funding because the military was working very closely with them. So, yeah, this is all just ridiculous. And you see, even with China right now, that it is true that I guess most of the fentanyl is coming from China. And Trump just says he made a deal with China and he got them to agree to try harder to keep fentanyl from coming. And why doesn't he reach out to Petro, who is fighting drugs, by the way? Why doesn't he reach out to him to coordinate better in halting the drug trade if he really cares about it? Right? None of this has to do with drugs. I mean, that it's just a fig leaf. It is a pretext for regime change, because the real drug that Trump is interested in is fossil fuels, right? That is the addiction that the world has, that he wants to keep fueling. And no country in the world, as far as we know, has more reserves of oil than Venezuela. So that's what this is about. And at times, Trump has been pretty candid about that, really.
Yeah. Kit, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that the yeah, I mean, of course, Venezuela's vast oil reserves have consistently made the country a target of subversion, immiseration, and sanctions. And yes, now it appears that the threat of outright invasion is being ramped up. Like, how serious do you think this is? Or, I mean, are incursions such as attacks on fishing vessels and a massive military buildup in Puerto Rico, like, is this just intimidation? Is Trump trying to make the Venezuelans play a game of chicken to see if they back down and act suitably servilely? If there is, all-out conflict, I mean, what are the US's prospects here? Because I mean, they're most recent military record against much less well-equipped, much less motivated opponents has not been very good, to say the least.
No, it's true. And, you saw that like 8 million Venezuelans have signed up for these civil militias to defend the country. The U.S. doesn't have anything like that. It can't take on a force like that at all, right? It would be another Vietnam if they were to really seriously invade. So that doesn't seem likely, though, again, Trump seems so unhinged you don't know what he's going to do. But I think it's unlikely that you're going to see a full-scale invasion. I do think it's a combination of, threatening, hoping that he might back down, also maybe hoping Venezuela will respond to defend some of these boats, and then have a Gulf of Tonkin, right, or remember the Maine type of situation with that could justify some sort of military assault on Venezuela. I think, the idea that he could engage in some targeted airstrikes of Venezuela, of oil installations, for example, other infrastructure, I think that's a real possibility, because the U.S., generally speaking, would have air dominance over Venezuela, though, Venezuela's gotten some of these anti-aircraft weapons from Russia, but I don't know if if they know how to use them at this point. I don't know if the Russians would help use them, which could lead to, World War III. I mean, so, you just don't know. But, Trump does seem, when you look at what he did with Iran, where he bombed a little bit, claimed victory and then went home, I could see something like that. I mean, Trump seems to have absolutely no attention span, right? I mean, he seems to get interested in something and then he loses interested in it. So we'll just, whatever the intention or whatever the goal, it's quite frightening, and it's destructive of regional stability, of the rule of law, and it's nothing, again, that we should support, and then we need to oppose it. This is really nothing, again, in the 21st century that we should be seeing. And we've moved back so far, and I think, the war in Gaza was really set the tone for this new century. I mean, that anything can go. There are no moral or legal limits to what can be done. And the empire is just off the rails. And I think, kind of as a segue to, I'm sure, what you both will want to talk about, this is really evidence of how desperate the capitalists are, right? The capitalist system is in deep crisis. And I think you're going to see very drastic measures taken either to save it or to salvage it for the few super rich, who think they're going to survive in bunkers or whatever they think they're going to do. And that's why this is really a threat to humankind. I mean, we're seeing humankind being threatened in a terrible way. And, we have to resist. It's not going to be easy at all, but we have to resist, and we have to support people like Petro who are resisting. I mean, he is resisting. He is sacrificing a lot to do that, and it is the time for those sorts of sacrifices, I think.
You're muted, Alex.
That segued us nicely there, Dan, which is the sort of the big question here, which is that looking at the Trump administration internally inside the domestic politics of the United States and the broader picture of U.S. decline. You have a gigantic stock market bubble based around 7 major so-called AI tech companies that's on the verge of popping. You have the long, well, I think what some economists have called the long depression in the US that's run from at least 2008, maybe arguably earlier, up to today. You have had the wages of US workers, according to what measure you want to use, but some say basically stand still in real terms since 1980. And so you have got ever increasing grinding poverty growing inside the United States. The Trump administration seems to flit between sort of melodramatic gallery playing, shall we say, over the top, like domestic repression via the ICE raids, promises of doing this, that, and the other, which don't amount to very much at all. But underlying it all, as you suggest, Dan, is a desperation, because if this bubble goes, then it will have a cascade effect upon the rest of the US economy, which has not grown at all. All the growth comes from the bubble. And there's been all of the unresolved issues from 2008, all the grinding poverty that's increased for the US working class since then. So this is clearly a dangerous time, because when the empire is cornered and needs a way out, they need to be able to loot some other countries or asset strip them to the bone. Trump effectively bought the Argentine election quite recently. They are clearly maneuvering to pull off something in Venezuela or something in Colombia. So it seems that this is now their chosen method to deal with their crisis, to find as many countries that they can basically reduce to the level of an old-fashioned colony and rob them blind for as much as they can get away with.
Yep, that seems to be the goal. And Venezuela seems to be the latest target. Gaza is part of that plan. You know, they want the rich, natural gas reserves off the coast of Gaza. Syria is being looted as we speak, with the connivance of the new Al-Qaeda leader, al-Jilani. That's exactly what's happening right now. And it's not being done for the benefit of the American people. It's being done for the super rich. Meanwhile, you know, food stamps are going to run out here at the end of this month, which is tomorrow. There's no plan to get those to people. So people who are already poor and don't have food are going to have less food. And the government's been shut down for weeks now. That there's no end in sight for that. The crisis is just beginning. And they're going to use all these armed people in the streets, ICE and National Guard, to, you know, they're preparing for major upheaval, I think. And that is the future right now. With that, I'm going to have to go. I actually have a call with the Colombian ambassador right now, and but I will leave this in your.
Send him our regards and best wishes, if you'd be so kind.
I will, and I leave this show in your capable hands. Thank you for having me. I always appreciate it.
God bless you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
You too.
All right, that was Dan Kovalik joining us there. Thank you, Dan, for joining us for a discussion of his work and the various different issues affecting, of course, Colombia, Venezuela, and the rest of Latin America. We are here with a Decline and Fall special, and myself and my comrade, co-conspirator, co-host Kit are going to have a bit of a discussion about the stuff that Dan's just been saying, due to the fact that this is obviously an emergency situation, given the threats and the level of sort of rabid, foaming at the mouth nonsense coming out from the White House. Kit, I wanted just to get your reflection on like Dan's last point there, though, which is that I saw a story this morning that the Trump administration is now talking about creating like National Guard rapid response forces for the specific purpose of domestic repression in the United States. Now, Trump himself legendarily has the attention span of a concussed fly, But this is clearly a plan that somebody's putting together. And with the level of repression increasing inside the United States, it seems that somebody in there understands that they're on the verge of something very bad domestically, and need the armed force of the state to put down whatever happens next. So clearly, they know they've got a massive problem, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that I think Dan's chilling final excerpt is really worth reflecting on here, because global capitalism has been limping with ever greater intensity, with ever greater enfeeblement since 2008. Right, China in that instance bailed out the US and European financial institutions. It's not going to do that again. It is reducing drastically its dollar and euro holdings. It is now compelling countries to trade with it using its own currency. I think, the Chinese always think at an absolute minimum, even in the most basic policy areas, many years ahead. They are looking forward to a massive financial crash. The US might have some very delusional people within its power structure, but they're not completely stupid. And they can see that, for all of Trump's boasts about how, well, the cost of everything apart from beef has gone down because of my amazing tariff, the most tariff of tariffs, that there is very, very serious dissent. And, to borrow an analogy from V from Vendetta, all it's going to take is one domino for the entire structure to start cascading down in pretty spectacular fashion. And so, we've seen, I've seen circulating throughout social media clips of ICE agents just brutally tackling people on the street without any suggestion they've done anything wrong. I mean, that is clearly an advertisement for two people within the US who are quite rightly unhappy and potentially of a mind to assert their lack of content with the present situation. This is what will happen when you step out of line. We have this national and ever-growing goon squad. I've seen some of the recruitment ads for ICE. The salaries are completely insane. As I've said before, I think we're in the wrong game, Alex. Although the benefit is that we can look at ourselves in the mirror in the morning. But the point is capitalism is in a very serious state of crisis. Nobody's coming to the rescue as before. It's not like the 30s when you had FDR come to the rescue. It's not like, say, 2008 when you had like an Obama figure who could pretend to be left and progressive while filling his government with Goldman Sachs advisors, putting a friendly face on yet more of the same. So this is a crucial inflection point. So again, while there is significant cause for concern and worry about what happens next, we're already seeing ratcheting crackdowns on dissent the world over. At the same time, as we have discussed many times on the show, capitalism's all out of honey, and all it has left to offer now is vinegar. It can't even provide a basic standard of living for people on comparatively high salaries anymore. What with rising living costs, ever ratcheting inflation, the unaffordability of basic goods, the ever broadening section of society, including people within the within the middle classes at least, who have to worry about feeding themselves and having roofs over their heads. The potential for mass dissent is massive. To go back to the very well publicized and well advertised demonstrations of ICE force. Again, this just strikes me as the British executing token Indians who dared rebel against their brutal rule. It's about trying to create the illusion of force when it doesn't actually exist, and that in itself feeds also in to the ramping up of war rhetoric and the sanctioning of Colombia. Colombia's leader, and the threats of war against Venezuela. There is a clear desperation by the U.S. empire and its assorted vassals and puppets and proxies and pets the world over to try and prove that they're more powerful than they actually are, because we are at a historical tipping point now.
Yeah.
And actually, it doesn't take very much. And I mean, to use an example, like, and we've discussed this in some recent shows and also some recent interviews. If you look at like what's being done in the Balkans, say, where there are a variety of politicians who, bearing in mind that the former constituent states of the former Yugoslavia, they lack political and economic independence. They lack militaries of any seriousness. They're not actual powers. A lot of them are just saying no, and the empire has no response at all.
Yes.
Apart from to try and suck up to them in the desperate hope that they don't step too far out of line, because that might give other people ideas.
Yes. Well, I think that there's a really good point about the illusion, trying to foster the illusion of control, because that's essentially all they've got left, really. I mean, all the wars that the empire's engaged in, that we have discussed many times on the program, so against Russia, against the attempts to decapitate the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was carried out by Israel, but it was clear that the US and the British were stood there in the background, and the US itself got more and more directly involved. The non-stop pressure campaign on China, for instance, and now the naked attempt to asset strip the entirety of Southern America. The buying of the Argentine election by Trump, and Trump admitted to this. He openly said it. So what we've got is a situation where the imperialists require the collapse and the destruction of big nations to make up for the massive problems that they've got internally. So Russia was supposed to fall because of the sanctions wave and because of the war in Ukraine. That was supposed to destabilize and collapse the Putin system. It didn't happen, and it's not going to happen either. The attack on Iran was supposed to maybe including the prior assassination of President Raisi, but certainly the decapitation strikes by the Israelis and their agents were meant to collapse the Islamic Republic, and again that didn't work, and in the end Israel came off worse. The attempts to try and get China to sabotage its own economy, which is what the US has been trying to do for years, have all failed. So now we're back to attempting to read the policies of William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt in the Caribbean and South America, whilst at the same time getting ready for a real shit show in the United States itself by having these ICE guys run around all over the place, like putting guns in people's faces. And I read a story, I think it was in the New York Times yesterday, that said that they didn't even do a criminal records check on these people. They're basically like anybody who applied, who could, handle a gun and presumably stand up straight sometimes and pull a trigger, was recruited. So what that says is that it's just literally anybody to be recruited to essentially be used as the president sees fit. That's basically what ICE has become, what it's going to be now. And in terms of just Trump's declared intentions, which is supposedly to increase deportations, Miami Herald says that in actual fact, Biden, as with Obama, was the more efficient deporter. That's in actual fact, the Democrats are better at it. So what Trump's TV show that he's putting on is about, as you say, asserting that they're in charge still. It's about a violent displays of the power of the federal government to run around the place, putting guns in people's faces, throwing people in the back of wagons, etc. It's not really about deportation. It is about establishing a precedent of like the usage of a militarized federal force against a civilian population. And as Dan was saying, this has been going on for years. They've been establishing these precedents for decades of militarizing the cops. Well, that started really arguably under Nixon, but it intensified dramatically under Reagan and then under Clinton. And then, you know, even like giving small town sheriff's departments army surplus light armored vehicles from the Afghan war. So they've been building up to this for a long time, but now the crisis is here. All of their attempts to destroy Russia, Iran, China have all failed. So now it's, well, try desperately to hold on for when the bubble bursts. And that's coming pretty fucking soon, it seems.
Yeah, indeed. And I might add as well, and this is something that we might do another special report on. So do stay tuned, folks. But like, I mean, this is the kind of tone that struck like RAND, which is this very influential think tank, which is primarily funded by the Pentagon. It routinely publishes strategy and policy papers, which are then adopted without fanfare by by the US government. It released at least on the surface, this a couple of weeks ago now, I think, this remarkably dovish paper on China, which is titled "Stabilizing the US-China Rivalry." Now, it struck me reading this, and there's also a fantastic Substacker called Simplicius the Thinker, who I think is very much worth following, is that he makes this idea. His overall reading of this RAND proposal document, which calls for a serious reconsideration and reconfiguration of US strategy towards China, it's not driven by any genuine desire for peaceful coexistence with China, or indeed a belief that China is an ally, rather than an adversary. The subtext is very much like, we don't have the wealth or the resources or the muscle to face up against them, right? And by token of continually provoking them, agitating Beijing, insulting them, we are creating problems for ourselves that we can't resolve. We are making this, and we in our most recent shows, we have discussed how the forced seizure of Nexperia, which was a Dutch-based China-linked chips manufacturer, which was due to US sanctions, intended to prevent China accessing microchips, had put significant swathes of European industry at risk. Like Volkswagen and Volvo are on the verge of having to shut down factories because of this seizure, and it gets worse and worse. And China has also responded to the companies which are trying to purchase from them directly what they now cannot from Nexperia, by saying, well, you have to pay us in our own currency, and we're going to set the rates, and you're not going to get as competitive prices as you once did. So it's like, as I say, like I don't think that there is any. I'm sure that within the imperial brain trust there remain these kind of Doctor Strangelove-esque lunatics who are probably descended from Nazis one way or another, who genuinely think that the US can and should take on China. But actually, slightly more sober, slightly saner voices recognize that this will be total legitimate suicide, and kind of global destruction on an absolutely unprecedented scale. And so, the tone this RAND report strikes is kind of, it's like this pleading to stop doing this stuff, which is getting us into serious trouble. It's painting us into corners we can't get out of, right? So, I mean, there's been a lot of talk among certain geopolitical analysts about, and we've discussed this as well, about the empire refocusing its efforts, at home, re-entrenching, shifting away from overseas adversaries. That's not to be taken for a major shift in priorities or outlook. It's a sign of desperation. It's a sign of weakness. It is a sign that, yes, at least some elements of the US power structure recognize that Washington is a shell of its former self. Like, this is not 1991 anymore. There are a wide variety of countries, even like Mexico, for instance, which of course does not really have a military worthy of the name. They're not taking orders from the US anymore, because they know that A, they have the BRICS alliance to fall back on, and B, if it comes to it, China and Russia and other countries would probably be more than, including North Korea actually, would probably be more than willing to assist them in any military standoff with the US. So, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to mention the Mexico thing actually, because there's been, you will remember, there's been talk of justifying a US military intervention into Mexico using the exact same reasons that they're giving for whatever they're doing with regard to Venezuela. I remember CIA Pete Buttigieg coming out with this in 2019, saying, we might have to go in due to the cartels. And then it's been repeated also, like Trump's come out with it. Various sort of reactionary figures in Trump's orbit have come out with it, saying we might have to go in due to the cartels. Well, I mean, first of all, I use this to sort of say that we are going to be doing more on the US military intelligence drug connection in the near future. So do return to us for that. But also, like, it opens up a whole question about what the tactics of the war on drugs and the war on terror, which is that in the war on drugs, as Dan was stating, the US would collaborate with ultra-violent drug gangs for the purposes of, power struggles, anti-communist death squad activity, that kind of thing. And then later on would claim, oh my God, there's drug gangs here. You have to let us establish military bases in your country and let our drug enforcement agency, which I think is a code for they force people to take drugs, to roam around with license to kill in a place like Ecuador or Bolivia. Sadly, Bolivia will be back at that stage now, given the government that they've now been landed with. But the demand is like, well, the US that creates a problem. The US then says, well, you've got a problem. Basically, you've got to allow us to turn your country into a garrison state where essentially we will run a unrestricted terror campaign on the justification of anti-drug action. So, and strangely enough, the cartels never seem to be affected by any of this and continue to deal. Same as we've discussed before with regard to France's so-called war on terror in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, which is, you've got an Al-Qaeda problem. Well, who put the Al-Qaeda men in business in the first place? Who put them there? And then the French would say, we have to stay here to fight Al-Qaeda. Strangely enough, Al-Qaeda never gets defeated in any of these countries. And everyone who observed the French say that they never actually fought them. They actually helped them. But this is the way these so-called wars on things are run. It's a problem created by the US and its allies, which the US and its allies then claim they're solving. But the game is always the same, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, and we have to think back to Manuel Noriega, who for a very long time was a paid CIA asset and was feeding the CIA with all sorts of sensitive information, while making quite the mint for himself via drug trafficking. Suddenly, when the U.S. government decided that, like, well, under the terms of the war on drugs, as you say, one of many wars on abstract nouns the U.S. has waged in recent decades, they realized, like, oh shit, he could spill the beans. So they did everything they could to try and help his defense. And so it's like, I think that we've reached a point within people frequently ask what stage of capitalism we're in. I think a better question is, what stage of imperialism are we in? And it's like, well, bearing in mind, as we've discussed, particularly in relation to our Yugoslav special, during the war on terror, the US was at war with its own assets that it used during the wars in Yugoslavia, right? So now any war on drugs that's being fought by the US is a war on their own assets that they used for a variety of malign purposes, who they knew were selling drugs. It's kind of the snake eating its own tail. At this stage, again, as this is a point that we've made many times on this show, I think that the long-term outlook actually is potentially quite positive. From all of this stuff, as bleak as it is, because there are no easy wars left for the US to fight. It is a beast cornered, much like Israel, much like Britain, kind of lashing out, desperately trying to maintain some, at least, semblance of a public impression that it retains power. But actually, it doesn't. It really doesn't. People like to make historical allusions to Britain's Suez crisis. I think we're past that with the US. Like, they have nothing like the muscle in any way that they used to. That doesn't mean that the US is not still dangerous. At all, far from it, and we need to be extremely wary about what they're doing. But there is an aspect of, well, the US has created all these problems for itself. It's going to try and solve them, probably make things worse for themselves in the long run. In the meantime, people like us need to avoid getting sucked in to these, intersign conflicts. As I closed out one recent Decline and Fall broadcast, just ignore these people, and they may well disappear in a puff of logic. I think that's where we're at now.
Yes, well, I think the fact that Trump is maybe it's good to close out the hour on this. Trump wavering all over the place on the Ukraine war, saying he wanted talks with the Russians, had talks with the Russians. Russians, unsurprisingly, didn't change their position. Trump then had a fit because the Russians refused basically to surrender to him, and now says that he's going to institute more sanctions on India, more sanctions on China. But then again, like, if he tries that, if he actually gets serious about waging like a sanctions war on those buying Russian oil, he's going to cause an oil price spike. So he can't do it, because that would mean basically the one thing that every American politician or bourgeois politician has tried to avoid is a spike in gas prices over the last 50 to 60 years, because that is what kills presidencies stone dead and kills political parties' chances in elections stone dead. So he can't actually do it without badly affecting the US economy and his own or his own party's political prospects in the midterm elections. Like, just to go to maybe circle back to where we started, like, I don't think they can invade Venezuela. I think they can try, but I don't think you've got anything that can match what the Venezuelans have got, which is not just an army, which Hugo Chavez made the very wise decision to purge all of the rich families from the officer corps and replace them with working class guys from the cities and the sons of peasants from the countryside, and also to arm millions and millions of Venezuelan citizens in defense of their nation, which is apparently advice he received, or Chavez and Maduro received, from both Castro and, interestingly, Qasem Soleimani, the late Iranian general. So what, the 3,000 Marines that Trump has at his disposal are going to go marching slowly into Caracas as if this was Port-au-Prince in 1910? It's just not going to work. And another thing that would sober up the most insane American politician is a whole load of body bags arriving all at the same time, which you can't cover up, and being revealed to be useless and incompetent and impotent when it comes down to it. And they can't take that risk. So good side and bad side to this. Bad side first. It means that if everything fails, which I think it's going to, in terms of looting Argentina is not going to be enough, looting Syria is not going to be enough. They can't get at the main big countries, which they would need to destroy to revive themselves, which means they're going to turn inward, which means the repression's coming inward. The war is coming inside the United States. Good side, it means ultimately that the US imperialism is really not long for this world, because they've survived this long by dividing and subdividing the domestic working class along racial and other lines and along income lines. If suddenly it's the case that they're having to do massive waves of repression inside the United States, using all this military hardware inside the United States, well, it's, blindfold off time for even the bits of the United States population that have been lying to themselves about the nature of the regime they live under for years. So I'll end on the positive note that with the imperialists being denied the ability to loot overseas, it finally comes back home, and that's the point where things start to seriously collapse.
Indeed, and I might add as well, somewhat tangentially, but it shouldn't be forgotten that that we've recently had a series of anniversaries of really quite brutal defeats of the US in Lebanon, when in 1981 the Reagan administration took it upon themselves to try and sort out the issues it itself had created in Lebanon by occupying the country, and an enormous number of US soldiers were killed, and they ended up scurrying away with their tail between their legs. US power is such a paper tiger at this point that that can't be distracted from or covered up or concealed by action elsewhere. And yeah, like, I think that we're seeing significant pushback by people across the kind of ideological gamut in the US against what ICE is doing domestically. People aren't falling for this. Nobody believes that there is this huge, apart from maybe some, the kind of zanier wing of MAGA, truly believes that there is this massive internal issue with illegal immigration. Nobody believes that Venezuela is the kind of nucleus of international drug smuggling. Like, there is a total lack of faith across the political aisle with established institutions, with what politicians say in public. And so, again, the short to medium term outlook is quite bleak, because, people will suffer and probably die as a result of the death throes of the US empire. But in the longer term, this is over now. this is over. And I think, and this is an analogy that a reference that I've made before. The US pullout from Afghanistan, even that was as embarrassing as it was, and the impotence of US power that was revealed as a result of this. That was quickly kind of forgotten about due to the war in Ukraine. The US is now facing a failure in its economic war on China, a total failure in its proxy war against Russia, where Emmanuel Todd, the French philosopher, who now has a Substack, which I recommend following, has stated that the impact of the US's inevitable defeat in the Ukraine war will be greater than the fallout from Vietnam, which put Americans and the American government off direct intervention for decades afterwards. And there's no possibility for the US to regroup after that. It's like there are causes for optimism, as depressing as this broadcast may have been in many ways. But we dearly thank the mighty Dan Kovalik for his input. I think that what he said was very much on point in terms of US strategy, in terms of the US perspectives on the region, and in the spirit of Georgia being transformed from a country led by a pro-EU, pro-NATO kind of centre-right neoliberal government into a bastion of anti-imperialist fervour by token of fighting off repeated colour revolution attempts. We could see the same happening throughout Latin America, just by token of governments refusing to take the US line and saying no, because they have very little to lose by doing so.
Indeed, and that's an excellent way to bring us to a conclusion for this very special episode. Thanks everybody for watching the program. We'll be back with our regular programming and more specials very soon. We've got an awful lot coming up for you. So be sure to subscribe to the Decline and Fall channel on YouTube. Subscribe over on the Substack as well, if you possibly can. We will be back with you again very soon. But we'll conclude by thanking you for tuning in and wishing you all the best in these turbulent, interesting times.
Indeed.